One meeting invite changes everything. Workforce optimization. By lunch, half the company has no access badge. Chapter 1. The turning point. The CEO goes on camera and says the quiet part like it's a relief. We have automated the roles. It doesn't start in factories, it starts in inboxes. A new generation of AI agents arrives that can actually finish tasks end to end, without collapsing into confusion the moment the world gets messy. They remember context. They call tools. They check their own work against policies and ledgers and logs. They escalate the rare edge cases to a human the way a junior employee would, except they do it instantly and they never sleep. For years, companies had used AI like a clever autocomplete. Useful, but fragile. Now it becomes a worker. The turning point is not a single model release, it is a standard. After a wave of failures and lawsuits, regulators introduce certification meant to slow deployment. Instead, it becomes a launch button. Once an agent is certified, insurers and auditors treat it as safe enough to scale, and procurement treats it as permission. The first major rollout happens in a bank. Not the flashy parts, not traders on screens, but the endless back office that keeps the money real. Reconciliations, compliance, fraud reviews, customer disputes. A system that used to require floors of analysts collapses into a cluster of agents supervised by a small team of specialists. The bank doesn't brag about jobs eliminated. It brags about response times. Competitors notice the same thing. They can't match the service without matching the headcount reduction. In a quarter, agent-first operations becomes a phrase that shows up in every earnings call. The wave moves from finance to insurance to law to marketing to software. It hits logistics planners, schedulers, paralegals, junior developers, HR coordinators, and the people who used to make meetings happen. It hits the work that was never glamorous, but kept the professional class stable. The old assumption was that automation would take physical jobs first, and society would have time to adjust. Instead, the adjustment is demanded from the people who write the rules, approve the budgets, and shape public opinion. They lose their jobs too. At first, companies try to soften it with language. Augmentation, empowerment, right-sizing. Then the numbers get too large for euphemisms. When unemployment begins climbing in the same cities that host the tech and finance hubs, the politics changes overnight. The anger isn't only about income, it's about betrayal. People were told to train, to learn, to adapt, and now the very skill of adapting is what the agents perform best. The first protests aren't ideological. They're desperate attempts to force a conversation with a system that doesn't need to answer. The agents keep working while humans chant outside, which makes the chanting feel like a performance for a world that has already moved on. A major government announces a national AI competitiveness acceleration, framed as a way to avoid recession and reduce backlogs. The effect is to make replacement policy. That is the divergence. Society does not drift into an automated economy. It is pushed into one by a combination of capability, certification, and fear of falling behind. And once the push begins, even leaders who hate it discover they can't stop it without breaking the economy they're sworn to protect. Chapter 2. The early effects. The first year feels contradictory. Companies report record productivity. Consumers see some prices fall. And yet whole job categories start fading like ink left in sunlight. The labor market doesn't collapse in one dramatic crash. It fractures. Entry-level roles vanish first. Not because agents are perfect, but because they are cheap enough to be good enough, and good enough is the enemy of apprenticeship. If the first rung on the ladder disappears, the rest of the ladder becomes a museum piece. Universities discover their graduates have nowhere to go because the first rung of the ladder is gone. The few entry-level roles left are really supervision roles, filled by the last cohort who squeezed in before the door closed. In workplaces that still employ humans, the atmosphere changes. Every employee becomes a manager of invisible colleagues. They don't write the report. They review it. They don't schedule the project. They watch it execute. They don't negotiate the contract. They approve the agent's draft and hope the risk is contained. Productivity rises, but so does paranoia, because the value of a human is now measured by how rarely they are needed. If you become too good at supervising, you teach the system how to need you less. That is the psychological trap. Corporations begin competing on a new axis. Not who has the best talent, but who can replace talent fastest without breaking the business. And a grey market grows for cheap, uncertified agents. Fraud becomes industrial, not because the agents are brilliant, but because they are tireless. Governments expand benefits and retraining, but the demand for labour is shrinking faster than any program can create it. Every budget becomes a fight, not about whether people deserve support, but about who pays for a society that no longer hires. The owners of the automated economy are visible now. They are platform companies and cloud providers, and the corporations that integrated first. So the first major backlash arrives as a fight over taxes, ownership, and control. A mild downturn becomes a sharp one, not because the machines stop producing, but because humans stop spending. Legitimacy is. In the streets, the rhetoric hardens. Some movements demand that humans be legally required in certain roles. Other movements demand that the state seize the platforms, because if most jobs are gone, then the infrastructure that replaced them is the new means of survival. Companies respond by building defenses. Facilities harden, and data centers become critical sites guarded like utilities. And the agents, working behind those walls, keep doing more. By the end of the second year, the early effects settle into a grim pattern. Work is still available, but it is polarized. At the top, the small class that designs, owns, and secures the systems. At the bottom, the stubbornly human work that cannot be automated cheaply yet and is increasingly desperate. In the middle, where most lives used to sit, there is a widening absence. And an absence creates pressure. Pressure finds a target. Chapter 3. The cracks appear. The first national crisis begins with a glitch that should have been minor. A certified agent platform ships an update. The update misinterprets a compliance rule across thousands of companies. Payments pause, invoices bounce, payrolls delay, nothing burns. But for millions of households living on thinner margins than politicians admit, a delayed paycheck is not an inconvenience. It is a threat. The outrage isn't focused on the bug. Everyone knows software has bugs. The outrage is focused on the helplessness. Customer support is an agent. Appeals are processed by an agent. The escalation path is a queue that never ends. The platform points to certification and audits. The standard becomes a shield and a trap at the same time. The crisis spills into the most sensitive systems next: welfare administration, job placement, and housing eligibility. Governments had adopted agents to reduce backlogs and cut costs. Now those agents become the interface between citizens and survival. Errors don't look like mistakes. They look like decisions. And a decision you cannot appeal becomes a form of power that feels like punishment. Protests return, larger and angrier. This time they target infrastructure, not factories, but data centers and the fiber routes that keep the agent economy coherent. Authorities respond by defining automation disruption as a major crime. Surveillance expands and identity rules tighten, justified as preventing sabotage. The state is pulled into a role it did not plan for. Protector of machine uptime. That shift changes politics at the root. If the government's job is to keep payments flowing and systems running, then dissent becomes a risk to stability, and stability becomes the only promise leaders can safely make. The international environment turns harsher too. If most jobs are gone, then economic power concentrates in the entities that own models, data, and compute. Countries treat compute like a strategic resource. Export controls spread and chip supply becomes a diplomatic weapon. A cyber attack that once would have been a headline becomes a national emergency, because a successful intrusion can now stall whole sectors that no longer have human fallbacks. And the attackers do not need to destroy anything. They only need to make systems fail safe. The first coordinated fail-safe event hits multiple automated logistics hubs in a single week. Deliveries slow. Inventory systems get stuck waiting for human sign-off that no longer exists at scale. Stores don't empty everywhere. They empty in patterns, city by city, like a new kind of weather. The public response is immediate. Hoarding, rumors, and flashes of mostly non-graphic violence amplified through screens. Then the political crack becomes social. People sort into insiders and outsiders, and the workplace stops acting as a mixing chamber. In this phase, the most alarming change is not economic. It is cultural. A generation starts to believe that being unnecessary is normal. They don't expect careers. They don't expect progress. They expect supervision. And supervised societies can be peaceful. They can also be brittle, because when most people feel they are being managed rather than represented, the smallest trigger can become an explosion. Chapter 4. The New Normal. Stability returns through a bargain that no one celebrates. Governments introduce a universal income, framed as a productivity dividend. If most jobs are gone, then income has to be decoupled from employment, or the consumer economy collapses completely. To pay for it, states tax automated output and take deeper control over the platforms that run the new labor force. The certification regime expands into licensing. Approved agents for sensitive sectors, approved models for payments, approved workflows for benefits. The official rationale is accountability. The practical effect is centralization. The state becomes a gatekeeper of the new labor force. Companies adapt by becoming quieter. They don't announce layoffs anymore. They announce transition plans. They maintain small human teams as symbolic compliance, not because humans are needed for production, but because humans are needed for legitimacy. A new corporate role appears everywhere. Not worker, witness, someone who can sign for decisions the agent made, so the system has a person to blame. At the household level, life reorganizes. People don't commute as much, and cities repurpose office districts into housing and heavily monitored public services. Education changes too. Schools focus less on career ladders and more on resilience, because careers are no longer the organizing principle of most lives. The new normal has conflict built into it, but the conflict changes shape. It is less about wages and more about access. Access to the stable payment tier. Access to neighborhoods with reliable services. Access to the remaining human jobs, which become prestigious, protected, and politically sensitive. And above all, access to the systems that decide. Because once the state and corporations both depend on agents, the true power is not owning machines. It is writing the rules that the machines follow. By the time society settles into this arrangement, the debate that once dominated politics has been replaced by a narrower one. Not whether automation should have happened, but who gets to live comfortably inside its consequences. Chapter 5. The World That Follows. In this world, employment is not the default expectation. It is a scarce status. Children grow up watching adults treat jobs the way earlier generations treated elite university admissions. Possible, competitive, and life-shaping. Most people live on a mix of guaranteed payments and the remaining human work at the edges of the automated economy. Care, repair, and community roles. The work that persists is the work that feels human enough to justify a human, even when it isn't strictly necessary. The automated economy runs quietly in the background. Supply chains adjust themselves. Invoices reconcile themselves. Customer complaints route through agents that are polite, patient, and rarely helpful in the way people actually want. When something breaks, it is fixed quickly, because uptime has become a political priority. People learn to read system status like weather. Daily life becomes more local. Without careers pulling people across countries and continents, communities rebuild around geography again. Some places become vibrant, filled with clubs, mutual aid, small projects, and public rituals that replace the old workplace routines. Other places become stagnant, dependent on transfers and controlled by rules written far away. The gap between these places is not primarily wealth, it is autonomy. The most respected people in this society are not necessarily the richest. They are the ones who can navigate the systems without being crushed by them and keep their communities from being erased by defaults. A new kind of literacy becomes the mark of adulthood. Not how to work for a boss, but how to live inside a machine-managed state without being erased by its defaults. The world still produces more than enough. Hunger is rarer. Shortages happen less often. But the emotional climate is different. A society where most jobs are gone must constantly manufacture meaning, because meaning used to fall out of necessity. Some people find it. Some don't. The system does not collapse. It does not become a utopia. It becomes a stable arrangement where the economy is efficient and the social contract is continuously patched, monitored, and enforced. In that arrangement, the most important question is no longer, what do you do? It is, are you inside the system or at its mercy? Epilogue. The branching point in this timeline isn't the moment AI becomes impressive. It's the moment society treats certification as a substitute for a new social contract. Replacing most jobs is not a technological event so much as a governance choice, made in slow, reasonable steps. Each step sounds practical, and each step is easier than the one before because the alternatives feel like economic suicide. That is why it's tempting. And that is why it's fragile. A world that runs on agents can keep producing, but it must constantly justify to humans why the humans still matter.